Hello, everybody. Can everyone hear me just fine? Good.
Yes.
Well, thank you, Jane, for that introduction. Can everyone see my screen of the presentation?
Yes.
Perfect. Well, welcome. Thank you for joining us today for our spring OLLI Brown Bag presentation. My name is Erin, and I'll be hosting alongside Jane today with this lovely group of women. As always, I want to give a Wiyot land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that Cal Poly Humboldt is on the land of the Wiyot people, including the Wiyot tribe, Bear River Rancheria, and Blue Lake Rancheria. Welcome here to OLLI. We believe that learning should never end. We're here to provide our community with the opportunity for extended learning and academic engagement. We want to thank you all and the friends of OLLI who support makes the weekly brown bag presentations possible. OLLI is a membership-based program. Our membership begins July 1st of every year and runs through June 30th. We are working to get our membership up to the required 1,000 members for our endowment and encourage all of you to join today if you haven't already. We always encourage inviting your friends and family. OLLI membership is an investment in our program and shows support for lifelong learning in our community. Anyone above 18 can join and participate in our OLLI classes and events. Some of our membership benefits include lower class fees, first priority registrations. You'll also gain access to a Humboldt State or Cal Poly Humboldt email address, discounts for the Jack Pass, eligibility for scholarships, student discounts at some local businesses, and the ability to participate in special interest groups. There are a couple upcoming classes, including some of ours, which is our Healthy Humboldt Research Wellness class, which Jane Woodward is actually a part of, so I encourage you all to join that, including also Italian for the Traveler and some amazing opportunities. All of these are located on our website, so please take a look if you have the time. We have a new release of liability form, which allows you to sign one for the semester, which is fantastic, unless it's a field trip. So if you haven't already, make sure to do that, and that's much of an easier process now. Let's Connect is an OLLI membership benefit that is a free weekly conversation on Friday mornings from 10 to 11. It's facilitated by Tracy Barnes-Priestley. These weekly conversations engage in new topics each week, including sharing meaningful memories, thought-provoking experiences, and of course, plenty of laughter. Please join us and our host to have conversations. It's just a lovely group of people, and they're always open to expanding. If you want to locate previous brown bag presentations, they're all being recorded and will be posted on the OLLI website shortly after the presentation. You can navigate the OLLI website by going to humboldt.edu/OLLI, select news and events in the toolbar, and click on brown bag presentations. We have many, many presentations there, so I suggest looking around in our archive. I hope you enjoy today's presentation. We'll continue providing these excellent free community presentations by joining OLLI and making donations at the OLLI at Cal Poly Humboldt today. Thank you for staying connected, and I hope you guys have a fantastic experience today. Now Jane Woodward is going to be introducing the presenters. I'm going to hand it off to you, Jane.
Yeah, Erin, while I'm talking, keep on top of the admission in the wedding room, because we're now 74 and growing.
Good problem.
So,
we'll do.
This is going to be very popular today because this is a great big long list of things to decide about, and the more information we can get, the better. I want to welcome the League and the several members who are here, including an Eureka Planning Commissioner, I believe it is. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan political organization which is set up to encourage informed and active participation in government, works to increase understanding of major public policy issues, and influences public policy through education and advocacy. And that's part of what they're doing today. Karen Price is our main host, and she recruited all these absolutely wonderful other people. So welcome aboard. We will You will have the opportunity to put questions in the chat, and we'll try to get to them as time allows. This could go on till at least 1:30, and I told them if they had more and people were more interested, they could continue. So it's totally, you are welcome. As long as we don't all wear out, go for it. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for joining us today. I'm Karen Price of the local league, and joining me from the league are Bird Lochte, raise your hand, and Anne Hartline. We are missing a member who ended up having to be on a plane as we speak, so I'm begging your indulgence for our having to sort of restructure things to fill the holes. Thanks for your patience. Mainly, I want to thank you, the participants, for setting aside 90 minutes of your busy days to take your voter privilege seriously and to inform yourselves more thoroughly. I'm hoping that this next hour and a half will be a civil and thoughtful and deep dive into some of what's on the November ballot. So thank you for joining us, and thank you to OLLI, to Jane, and to Aaron for your help, especially your technical assistance, without which I would be totally sunk. So also joining us, and I'm really excited about this, is Kristen Kenyon. She's the City of Eureka's Development Services Director. She's waving to you there. And Sean Quincy, who's the Deputy County Administrative Officer. He's waving. Kristen is going to help with questions about Measure F, and Sean is going to help us with questions about Measure O. We have chosen to focus among the 13 local measures on those two because they are the most controversial, the most complex, and have the most far-reaching consequences. As you know, only people who live in Eureka can vote on Measure F. And in spite of that, we chose to focus on it because Eureka is our county seat, and what happens in Eureka affects the whole county. And the issues have been so complex and so widely debated that we thought it would be good to unpack it. So that's our reasoning for spending a lot of time on Measure F. But first of all, the next 9 slides, slide please, is a series of resources available to you. The websites mentioned are going to be in the chat. So this first one is a resource that we want you to know about. It's called Vote 411. And if you go to vote411.org and enter your address, your own personalized ballot will come up. And it's very helpful. The second, the slide's already up. Oh no, that's not the right slide, sorry. The best source of information regarding the propositions is the Voter Information Guide. And the Voter Information Guide you should already receive. Looks like this. And they began being sent out a week ago today. So hopefully most of you have it. That is actually the most thorough compendium of information. And I really invite you to take a good look at it. The Secretary of State phone number is up there. Also, the Secretary of State website for elections, if you want further information. And also the calvotes.org, which is the League of Women Voters website, which will take you to the Easy Voter Guide. It looks like this. It's like a simplified version of the general voting guide. And it's put out by the League, and it's nonpartisan and really clear. I recommend that. And then finally, at that same website, you can find the pros and cons, which look like this. You can get them up on your computer. We leaned heavily on those for the state measures. And those things just are very, very helpful. Finally, well, not finally, but one more resource is Where's My Ballot? This would be slide 5. And Where's My Ballot.sos.cal.gov, you can register for, and it will actually tell you by text message when your ballot is received and when it's fed through the voting machine. So you can actually literally track your ballot by signing up for Where's My Ballot. And vote by mail slide, please, slide 6. The most common mistakes and vote for mail or by mail ballots are failing to sign your name on the envelope. It's the return envelope and the name has to be signed on the outside. And 2, returning the ballot too late. The ballot has to be postmarked by Election Day, November 5th, and it has to be received by November 12th, 1 week later. So ballots that are postmarked on the 6th will not be accepted. In addition to mailing your ballot, for which there's no needed stamp, you can also go to any of the vote centers or the ballot drop boxes. Vote centers are slide 7. And these are also to be found, the vote centers and the drop box locations can be found in this official Humboldt County Voter Information Guide, which was mailed to everybody before the ballots were mailed. And on the first 2 pages, you will find a complete listing of vote center locations and drop box locations. It's also online at humboldtgov.org. So lots of different ways to find that. And then finally, there's in the pros and cons, there's a list of how to evaluate a ballot proposition. That's slide 10. And I would like to come back to this if we have time. Now there's elections office contact information that's in the chat. Juan Cervantes, and he's incredibly helpful. This slide we will come back to if we have time. It's really helpful about how to evaluate a ballot proposition, but I don't want to get in the way of the time of our visiting experts, so I'm going to put that on hold. Okay, now we're at slide 11. There are 13 local ballot measures, and all of them have an impartial analysis that has been developed by either their city council or the county council. And that can be found at the humboldtgov.org website. All you have to do is go to elections and then in the search bar, put in impartial analyses and then go to 2024. It will take you to an impartial analysis. We won't have time to go over all of them in detail. And so if you're in the districts where you would be voting for one of these school bond measures or special tax measures or sales tax, I really encourage you to go to the elections website and read those impartial analyses. They're really, really excellent, really well done. We have great county and city councils. So of the 13 local measures, there are 4 school bond measures. And these require a 55% voter approval to pass. There's a Ferndale Unified School District for $9.8 million. There's a Cutton School District bond measure for $5 million. There's a Redwoods Community College District for $120 million. And there's a McKinleyville School District bond for $18.5 million. So just a quick reminder, bonds are a way that schools and other municipalities raise funds for larger infrastructure projects. Laws restrict the use of bond funds to specified projects, and they require oversight and independent audit. If approved, the school district will borrow the money and it will be paid back with interest over a long term. It's usually 20 or 40 years, can even be longer. The district raises money for the interest payments by levying property taxes on the district residents. The total amount paid for a bond will usually be slightly less than double the initial amount due to interest. So slide 12. There are 4 sales tax measures on the November ballot, and these require a simple majority of voter approval to pass as they all go to the general fund. A distinction that you'll hear a lot in this presentation is that revenues that go to a municipality's general fund only require a simple majority of votes to pass. A special tax measure, which does not go to the general fund, but is specified to special projects, requires a 2/3 vote of the people to pass. So all 4 of these go to the general fund and they all require a simple majority. Trinidad is seeking to extend its current 0.75% sales increase to 4 more years, up to 2029. So it's not a new tax, it's seeking to extend a tax that's already in place. and it's estimated to bring in $175,000 to the general fund. Arcata is proposing a new sales tax increase from the current 0.75% to 1.5%, adding an estimated $2.6 million to the general fund. Fortuna also seeks a new sales tax increase from its current 0.75% to 1.5%, adding an estimated $1.8 million annually. This law would sunset in 2033. And then finally, Measure O is an all-county 1% sales tax increase, which will be dealt with in more length shortly. There are also 3 special tax measures on the Humboldt ballot. These special taxes, as I said, require a 2/3 approval. And they are the Neeland Fire District, the Peninsula Community Services District, and the Arcata School District Special Tax, which is a renewal of a 2016 tax, which would run until 2026. Again, the websites of the respective cities and the county website all have more information about these. There is one request, Measure M, by the Arcata Fire District to increase the annual appropriation limit in the amount of taxes collected from the 2020 special tax. So this is not a new tax. It's just a request that needs to be made every 4 years for the Arcata Fire District to take more of an appropriation out of the taxes collected. It's a simple majority vote. And then finally, there is Measure F to change the general plan for Eureka's housing element. And as we said, this is going to be information dense, and I hope you'll hang in there. There's a lot of information, so buckle up. And Bird is going to start out with telling us about this. Slide 14, please.
So Measure F was put on the ballot through the initiative process because the originators of the measure, Eureka Housing for All, obtained over 3,000 signatures to qualify for the ballot. Measure F is a proposal to amend the housing element of the Eureka General Plan by addressing all 21 of the city-owned public parking lots, as well as zoning for the former Jacobs Middle School site on Allard Avenue in Eureka, which is owned by the Eureka Unified School District. Only residents of the city of Eureka can vote on this measure, as Karen said, but it does have ramifications for every resident in the county. The measure is very complex and possibly confusing. State agencies have already shown that they are aware of this measure and have indicated interest by submitting letters to the city. These agencies include the California Attorney General, as well as the Department of Housing and Community Development, which certifies city housing elements. The nonprofit Cal Housing Defense Fund has also submitted a letter of concern. Kristen Kenyon is here from the City of Eureka Development Services Director, so I hope that you will have questions for her after you hear all of the unbiased information and what the proponents and opponents have to say. Next slide, please. The question is, should the City of Eureka's general plan housing element be amended as Measure F affects city-owned parking lots and the Eureka City Schools' owned Jacobs site? If passed, this amended part of the housing element of the general plan could only be changed by another vote of the people. You may remember that the City of Eureka's general plan was approved after a great deal of input over several years from the community. The amendment will affect 21 city-owned parking lots and the Jacobs site owned by Eureka City Schools. Karen will give you an overview of the impartial analysis and other factual information about Measure F before we move to what the supporters and opponents have to say about the measure. At the end of the presentation, websites for both the supporters and opponents will be put in the chat. Next slide.
Okay. The proposed general plan amendment would create the Off-Street Public Parking Overlay Designation, OSPP. This overlay would apply to 21 city-owned parking lots in Old Town Eureka, and it would limit the use of these parking lots to the following: public parking, high-density residential, above ground floor parking or garaged public parking, provided there is no reduction in current public parking spaces and additional parking will be added for occupants of the new residential development. Bike parking. The project that was proposed by the Wiyot tribe will be allowed. That's on parking lots at 5th and D and 6th and L. And there are no other uses, commercial or otherwise, which would be permitted for these parking lots. Next slide. The Jacob site has also proposed an overlay called the Housing for All Overlay Designation. This is shortened to HFA. And it would apply to the Jacob site located at 674 Allard Avenue. The site's owned by Eureka City Schools and not by the city of Eureka. School districts, like other public entities such as the CHP, are not generally bound by local zoning. The HFA overlay expands the use of the Jacob site, which is currently limited to public facilities, to allow the following: high-density residential, R3, as to at least 40% of the ground area, medium-density residential, R2, low-density residential, R1, public and quasi-public uses compatible with a residential setting, and neighborhood serving commercial uses. So that's obviously a very extensive reboot of the area. The initiative's proposed changes to the City of Eureka's general plan could only be amended or removed by a further vote of the people. Slide 18. The city attorney's impartial analysis, I've kind of shortened it here. She summarizes by saying Measure F would change the regulations on the use of the 20 city-owned public parking lots and the former Jacob site owned by Eureka City Schools, would amend an existing implementation measure of the city's housing element, removing the city's commitment to develop a minimum number of affordable housing units on 6 city-owned parking lots. So in other words, there are already agreements with regard to 6 of the city-owned parking lots. The city has existing agreements for affordable housing. So are we getting some feedback here? I'm getting feedback. For the Earth Center and the Link housing projects, Measure F parking requirements would pose significant challenges and could trigger state law remedies. Next slide, please. The impartial analysis continues, and this is just an aside. There's a hierarchy of laws: federal, state, local, and state law can preempt local law. It supersedes local law, but many local cities resist that, and there's often a friction between local law, state law, and federal law. So there's a little bit of background. The state laws that could impact Measure F include any housing element changes, such as those proposed by Measure F, must be reviewed and certified by the California Department of Housing and Community Development, HCD. Keep that in mind because you'll hear more about HCD. HCD have authority to determine if the city remains in compliance or has fallen out of compliance if Measure F passes. Existing agreements may be subject to zoning requirements that were in place at the time of approval. Affordable and senior housing developers are entitled to certain concessions, waivers, or reductions of local development standards, including parking requirements. And with limited exceptions, a public agency cannot impose or enforce minimum parking requirements on a development project located within 1/2 mile of public transit, as are virtually all of the projects that have been discussed. Slide 20. The HCD, Housing and Community Development Department, which I mentioned above, on October 9th, sent the mayor of Eureka and the city council a letter of technical assistance. And in this letter, they essentially gave a few warnings. Remember, this is the state entity that determines if the local housing elements are aligned with state law. Eureka's element was approved as compliant in November 2022. However, the proposed amendment would require a recertification and review. And this is where we take the deep dive. Eureka, like every municipality, was assigned a regional housing needs allocation, RHNA, of 952 units. 378 of those must be for lower income occupants. Eureka met this obligation in part by declaring some of the downtown parking lots surplus and moving ahead with housing projects on them. If Measure F passes, the city would need to resubmit their housing element to HCD, which would assess if the new proposed housing sites are suitable and available. The letter states, the element must demonstrate that any new development standards do not pose a constraint to the development of housing and do not inhibit compliance with other state housing laws, including the state density bonus law and minimum parking limitations within 1/2 mile of public transit. The state density bonus law is an incentive to developers of up to 35% increase in the project density if they agree to build more affordable or more senior units. So that's a state law. The HCD letter continues, this is slide 21, please. That should Measure F pass and the city's housing elements be assessed as non-compliant with state housing law, there could be the following consequences. And I need to note here that it's possible that the city could retain its compliance status by working with the HCD. The decision lies entirely in the hands of the Department of Housing and Community Development. But these are the possible consequences that the letter from HCD outlined. There could be an ineligibility or delay in receiving certain state funds. There could be a referral to the California Office of the Attorney General. There could be court-imposed financial penalties, which could include a minimum of $10,000 a month and associated attorney's costs for any action brought by the AGO, the Attorney General's Office, or HCD to enforce the adoption of housing element revisions. There could be a loss of local authority on land use to a court-appointed agent. There could be the application of the builder's remedy, which I'll talk about in a moment. And the city could lose its pro-housing designation, which it received last January. It's one of 37 communities in the state who have received this pro-housing designation. And it allows Eureka access to funding opportunities and also to be more competitive for other funding. So slide 22, please. The builder's remedy is a state provision which allows for a developer to file an application to build in an area that is currently out of compliance with state law. As long as the builder's plans include 20% for affordable housing, their proposal must be accepted without being subject to any local zoning requirements. This means that a project which meets the criterion for affordable housing would not be subject to any other zoning limitations in an area that is out of compliance in their housing element. A recent example given was, not in this letter, but elsewhere, an 18-story apartment house that was built in Santa Monica when it was out of compliance. And again, it's up to the HCD whether or not the element is judged to be in or out of compliance. It's not automatic, but it would be out. Slide 23, please. The California Highway Patrol and the California Housing Defense Fund have both, there are complications with both of these. The first, CHP, is once again in discussion with Eureka City Schools about buying the Jacobs site for their regional headquarters. And again, the CHP isn't subject to zoning laws. It can use any property which it owns for its own needs. And If the CHP does develop that land, it's an open question whether there would be room for any housing on the property or not. It's just an open question. There might be. The California Housing Defense Fund is a nonprofit which is seeking to improve affordability and accessibility. And it sent the city of Eureka a letter of concern about the proposals of Measure F. Quote, the removal of these sites would result in a shortfall of 66 very low income units, rendering the city's housing element non-compliant with state law. It would no longer be developing enough affordable housing to hit the quotas that have been assigned to it. Cal HDF sees the risk of a lawsuit against Eureka by the Attorney General as being quite real. As of February 2024, the Attorney General had sued 6 cities for being out of compliance. And on February 5th of this year, Attorney General Bonta filed a friend of the court brief supporting the city of Eureka in a lawsuit brought by the backers of Measure F, challenging its housing element. So those are all issues that have been raised. And now, next slide, please, 24. I want to tell you what this measure's supporters say. Measure F will protect the economic vitality of Eureka's historic downtown by preserving the parking that downtown's restaurants, shops, and merchants need to survive. Measure F would enable the Jacobs site to become planned affordable housing for working and middle-income families. It would also enable Eureka to greatly increase the number of affordable housing units the city can provide. It would enable the housing downtown for working and middle-income families instead of the hundreds of units of very low and low-income housing the city has planned. The supporters say, we want the additional housing Measure F enables, not just the limited housing currently planned that wipes out downtown parking. We want a thriving future for Eureka. Slide 25, please. Supporters also cite a poll from the polling firm Fairbank, Maslin, Mullen, Metz and Associates that found that 60% of the Eureka voters polled want the Jacobs site to become housing as opposed to 22% who favor a CHP headquarters. Please note that Housing for All spokesperson Gail Reimer has said that she thinks there could be room for both housing and the CHP headquarters on the Jacobs site. Supporters say that rezoning the Jacobs site will open it for hundreds of new homes to be built. The poll also found that 62% of Eureka voters who were polled supported maintaining housing to keep downtown Eureka vibrant as a center for tourism through local shops and restaurants, as well as cultural events by maintaining parking to accommodate people. Supporters say that removing parking from downtown would result in businesses closing or moving away because they wouldn't be accessible because there wouldn't be enough parking. More information can be found on the website Eureka Housing for All 2024. Slide 27, please. Finally, supporters say that since the measure does not prevent construction of any housing units, planned or future, it does not invalidate Eureka's general plan. There is no automatic legal mechanism resulting in the city's housing element being decertified at the moment Measure F passes. If the state took the position that Measure F somehow caused the housing elements to be out of substantial compliance, state law prescribes a process by which the city can correct that issue. And finally, the supporters say that the builder's remedy would only come into play if the state determined that the measure caused the housing element to be out of substantial compliance and the city refused to make corrective changes. Okay, so now we're going on to opponents with Bird.
Yes, the opponents, let's see. A slide for the opponents, please, 28. Yes. Opponents say that Measure F would halt development on 6 lots already slated for affordable housing projects, with 199 housing units already approved for construction, with $45 million of funding already procured. They say it would also make affordable housing almost impossible downtown because of the requirement for alternative parking such as underground or garage parking that would make the cost too great for low-income housing. The opponents say the city would lose $169.8 million in one-time construction revenue, about 1,000 construction jobs, and about $7.2 million per year in retail spending from new residents living downtown. The opponents also say that Measure F risks violating state law, which Karen mentioned is up to the CDH, is it? The
HCD.
HCD, to make that determination. The opponents say that the city would risk violating the state law and become out of compliance in its housing element. They say that it would put the city at risk for non-compliance with state housing law and could result in a loss of state funding as well as monthly fines. They also say that the overlay zoning in Measure F does not meet state law for minimum density requirements for low-income housing. Also, the Jacobs property suggested to provide the required housing does not belong to the Eureka City, but to the Eureka City schools. It is not under the control of the city of Eureka, and it cannot be counted in revised housing element to meet state law. Next slide, please. Opponents also say that this measure puts Eureka at risk of losing its pro-housing designation. As one of 37 cities in the state so designated, that gives Eureka priority for state funding. Opponents also say that Measure F pits working and middle-income families, such as retired seniors, young families, and working people, against, in quotation marks, low-income and very low-income families. They state that the family of 4 making between $41,250 and $65,950 annually would qualify for the new housing downtown that is already proposed and approved. Opponents say that the measure does not ensure any housing will be built at the Jacobs site, since that site is owned by Eureka City Schools. They are free to sell it or use it as they wish, regardless of zoning. Opponents say that the amendments proposed by Measure F put the city at risk of litigation on several fronts by putting the city out of compliance with state law. Next slide. Karen?
So the financial disclosures, yes on F has raised $1,587,554 as of October 9th. All but 600 of those dollars were donated by Security National LLC. No on F has raised $20,537, or 1.2% of the Security National contributions. So now we welcome Kristen Kenyon. I have a list of questions for her, but I'm also hoping that some of you will put questions in the chat that she can answer. I'm going to start off with one question, Kristen, about this October 9th letter of technical assistance from the Department of Housing and Community Development. Could you highlight the most important aspects of that letter for us?
Hi, thanks for having me. The HCD letter, I think, the key parts of it are that they go over, that it's not something we have complete local control over. Our housing element has to be certified as being in substantial compliance with state law by HCD. So what if the initiative passes, we're going to have to resubmit our housing element to HCD for review. It also talks about all the work that went into their original certification in 2019, and we swapped some city parcels in 2022, and got recertification after a lengthy process. And in their letters, when they certified, they definitely called out the city parking lot program specifically as a key important program for finding the city in compliance with state housing law. And they're basically saying, you know, when they review this change, if the initiative gets adopted, they're going to look and see if we still have enough sites in our housing element inventory where we show that we can, we have adequate and suitable space for these 952 units we've been assigned to build during this housing element cycle. So between 2019 and August of 2027. And they also said they're going to look to see if there's any new development standards that constrain development of housing inconsistent with state law. And then they reference 2 state laws that would trump our ability to impose any parking standards on affordable housing. And then they give this list of consequences if they were to revoke our certification. Which the biggest consequence is that we would no longer be eligible for a bunch of funding that we rely on for various things, in addition to housing, like funding, for instance, for our bike plan and complete streets projects and other things as well.
Okay. Are there any questions in the chat from participants to ask of Kristen while she's here with us?
I don't see any.
Okay. Kristen, I
have
one
a
more
question.
Oh, please.
I understand one of the questions was, who is Security National? That is Rob Barkley. And he has a number of employees who park in some of these parking lots. But I'm sure they don't park in all the parking lots. And I understand that there is, based on a study by the city, that there is sufficient parking available for Security National employments downtown, even if this plan is put into place. Is there actual data on that?
Yes. So the city goes out and does parking counts in our city-owned parking lots every summer at different times during the day. And we did parking counts every year from 2011 to 2019, skipped a few years, and then did parking counts in 2023 and 2024. And then we also did this parking study. We paid a consultant to do a parking study, and I have data from it that I can show that shows that there are some of our parking lots are very well used. There's an industry threshold of 85% occupancy. That's ideal. And we have some parking lots that are over that, but we have some parking lots too that are really under that. Like for instance, the 2 parking lots across from the Adorni Center on 2nd Street, they're at like 6 or 4% peak occupancy, and they're so unoccupied, they're kind of unsafe. So if you look at all of our spaces together and all of the street parking, overall we're very low. But so what we've determined is not that we don't have enough spaces, is that we're not managing our spaces well. And so the parking management study had all these ideas of how we can improve our parking management, and we're starting to work on implementing those. But when the initiative first was added to the ballot, we hired Proforma, which was this economic consultant, and they did some calculations and to show that even if we lost all of the public parking spaces on these 6 lots that are slated for affordable housing development, our overall parking supply is still quite large, way below 85% occupancy.
Can I presume that we're aiming our housing for those
parking lots that do not have high use, over 85%, and are in areas that would not cause problems for people employed, not just by Security National, but by people trying to shop in those areas or are otherwise employed in those areas?
The 6 parking lots are none of them are actually in Old Town. They're all in downtown, and a few of them are well utilized. Like one of the ones that is going to the Wiat is well utilized. We don't have data on who specifically is using it, if it's just the employees of the adjacent business or if it's more broadly used by other people. But they're all sort of spread out, and they all have different amounts of use currently.
Okay. Kristen, I
you.
want to thank you so much. I know that there are even more questions in the chat, but I'm also mindful of those who can't vote on Measure F and feel like we've already spent too much time on it. But I just want to thank you for your expertise and your willingness to join us.
Yeah, and anybody can reach out to me with questions
Great.
at planning@eurekaca.gov. And also we have, if you just put in your search browser, City of Eureka Measure F, we have a page on Measure F that has a bunch of analysis on it that you can read.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And we're going to move on now to Measure O, which is slide 32, please. This is a county-wide sales tax measure. The question is, shall a measure enacting a 1 cent sales tax generating approximately $24 million annually for general government purposes until ended by voters with citizens' oversight, annual audits, public disclosure, all funds used only for local services be adopted? Next slide. So the situation is, next slide, please. The situation is that Humboldt County has some of the worst roads in the state. The stated intention of this tax is to deal with failing infrastructure, including bridges, roads, local streets, and potholes. Emergency response times and emergency evacuation routes can be hindered by poor roads, and bus service needs have gone unmet for lack of funds to expand bus routes. Slide 33, please. The state of California has usurped $500 million over the past 30 years via property tax reallocations. And this means it's giving less to the counties and keeping more for state needs. In the 2023-4 tax year alone, $25 million was taken back from Humboldt County. Humboldt County lacks the matching funds to qualify for state and federal funds to fix roads and infrastructure. This tax could potentially allow the county to meet the matching funds requirement and access state and federal funds. Humboldt County has about $1 billion worth of infrastructure, which requires repair and maintenance over long time frames, 10 to 20 years and more. Slide 34, please. This is the impartial analysis summary. Measure O is a 1% transaction and use tax, sales tax. It's proposed by the Humboldt County Board of Supervisors, and it taxes gross receipts of any retailer. Measure O would apply throughout the entire county, including both the unincorporated areas of the county and within each incorporated city. If Measure O passes, the sales tax throughout the unincorporated county will be raised to 8.75%. In Arcata, Ferndale, Fortuna, and Trinidad, sales tax would be 9.5%. In Rio Dell and Blue Lake, it would be 9.75%. And in Eureka, it would be 10.25%. Slide 35, please. Measure O is a general tax which may be spent on any general government purposes. A general tax requires a simple majority to pass. The specific uses listed are best considered the county's stated intentions for the funds. And again, these are maintaining 911 response times, preparing for natural disasters, repairing deteriorating roads, fixing potholes, maintaining evacuation routes, and extending and maintaining bus services. Also, to become eligible for Humboldt's fair share of state and federal road funds. The measure creates a Citizens Oversight Committee, which may be the county's existing audit committee, to conduct annual audits of the expenditures of revenues generated by the tax. Next slide, please. Supporters say that this would allow the maintenance of 911 emergency response times, repair the deteriorating infrastructure already mentioned, as well as emergency evacuation routes, maintain bus services for seniors, low income, and people with disability. Supporters say that it is fiscally accountable. The spending would be overseen by a panel of experts, reviewed by a citizen audit committee, and requires public disclosure of all spending. It would allow Humboldt to qualify for matching funds. It would not increase property taxes or income taxes, and it would create local jobs. It also, supporters say, slide 37, that it makes sure that visitors to Humboldt County pay their fair share to maintain local roads. And supporters note that county roads are currently in very poor repair, and they will become more expensive to fix the longer the task is delayed. The state rating for our roads is at 49 or poor. Slide 38. Opponents say, next slide please, thank you, that this measure would add 1% sales tax across the entire county, including the larger cities, Eureka, Arcata, and Fortuna, which already pay more sales tax than unincorporated areas. That the measure puts an unfair burden on the 3 largest cities, with overall higher taxes than the county at large. If both measures P for Fortuna and H for Arcata pass, those cities would also have, like Eureka, a 10.25% sales tax. And opponents say the tax revenues would go to the general fund and could potentially be used to fund existing liabilities, such as pensions, rather than the roads, bridges, potholes, evacuation routes, etc., that is the intended purpose. So because these are best considered the county's stated intention for the funds, it's unsure whether or not that's actually where the money would end up. The Oversight Committee may be an existing audit committee, which opponents call a hand-picked county committee. And the law has no sunset provision, which requires another vote of the people to change. So after hearing the supporters and opponents, we turn to questions for Sean Quincy, the Deputy County Administrative Officer. Sean, thank you for being with us.
Having me.
I don't see you. There you are. So I'm going to start us off with one question. As I understand it, people who have concerns about Measure O, they have many of them, but one of them is how could they be reassured that the revenues of Measure O would actually go for the intended stated purposes, given that it goes to the general fund?
Yeah, this is an important concern. And like you mentioned, some of the other measures on the ballot are pretty similar in that way, in the cities too. And like the impartial analysis says, that the stated intention is for this to go to roads and bus services. And so this is stated in the board's resolution. And the reason why the resolutions are significant, every tax measure that goes to the people has to have a resolution that gives the whereas clauses why we're essentially doing this. And so in the whereas clauses that the board adopted, it all talks about roads and bus services. The Measure Z tax that was passed back in 24 and then reauthorized in 2018 is structured the same way, as far as that funding is legally allowable for any purpose. And the board has taken that resolution and funneled it through or had it reviewed by the Measure Z committee. and they really define what projects will be funded each year. They kind of define public safety in that way. That's what Measure Z was intended for. And they have adopted a spending plan to lock that funding down for the next several years. And so it's a long way of me saying that the accountability of the measure is really detailed in the resolution, and the committees that will be overseeing these funds. The audit committee that is mentioned there is important to note that it is chaired by the independently elected auditor, controller, and treasurer tax collector. These elected officials do not answer to the Board of Supervisors. They don't take direction from the Board of Supervisors. And so they will be reporting out on where the funding is spent. And so if, however the funding is spent, they will publicly report out on this funding.
I have a question.
Please.
Could you talk more about the condition of the roads here in Eureka and the county in general, compare them to the rest of the state?
Yeah, absolutely. So we, county roads passed a threshold recently in the bad way. Every 4 years, we have to go and have our roads assessed independently in order to receive state gas tax funds. And in 2012, we assessed our roads, and they were kind of in the average condition. I think they're in the mid 60s. And I'm sorry, on a scale of 0 to 100, 100 being a brand new road, 0 being a failed road. So in 2012, we were in the mid 60s. Our assessment also says, what will it take for us to get up to the 70 mark in 10 years? How much funding will it take? And the reason why the 70 mark is important is because that's kind of a golden area where it takes less funding to maintain a road and keep it in good shape, as opposed to reconstructing the road. That 2012 report said that it would take $150 million over 10 years to get us up to the 70 mark. In 2017, we went back and did another study, and that report came back and said that we would need $300 million over the next 10 years to get up to the 70 mark. 2022, we did another study, and now that number is $500 million, because each time they go and do this assessment, we, or the board has not been able to provide additional local funding to improve the roads. So our road condition has dropped down into the very poor category. We're at 48 or 49 countywide. And the reason why that is significant is because once your roads get into that category, then they deteriorate even at a faster rate. The bases start to crumble, and then you have to do full repairs as opposed to more surface level maintenance. And
Wow.
the statewide average is about 66. There are 6 counties in the state that are in the very good category, and each of those counties have local revenue measures.
Who are the good counties? Are they the cities?
That's a good, they are a lot of it's San Francisco, Marin, LA, some of these, the bigger, typically the larger urban cities that have those measures, and they can leverage additional state and federal funding for larger projects.
Okay.
So the conclusion is that the longer we wait, the more expensive it becomes, because they've deteriorated so far. You can't just fix it. You have to replace it, basically, right?
That's correct.
And then we've got inflation. So it's better to take the cost now than postpone.
Can I follow up a little bit? Can you break down the quality of paved roads, say in Eureka versus the rest of the county, and compared to Trinidad and Arcata? Fortuna?
I'm not sure what the road conditions are in Eureka, though I know that Eureka recently, and sorry, Kristen, I hope I don't step on toes here, but I know that Eureka recently passed a measure that is funding a lot of their road work. You've seen a lot of recent construction in Eureka here. I will say that this measure is designed to fund county roads. So, roads in that connect our cities together, and a lot of the evacuation routes. Like Neeland Road is an evacuation route, important evacuation route. If the state highways go down, that's one that'll help us get out of the community. Bell Springs Road is another one that is used when 101 goes down. So that's what this measure is designed to fund, but I can't really speak to the condition of all the city roads.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Thank you so much, Sean. I'm going to ask just one further question that's in the chat, and then we'll have to move on to the state propositions. This is from Jane Woodward. If the committee does not comply with the desired spending priorities, what recourse does the public have?
Yeah, it would be number one is they could get it put on the ballot to repeal the measure, right? And then there's a lot of political pressure that could be done. Our one of the fortunate things of living in a small rural community like this is that our media is really engaged, and communities like this are really engaged. And the spending that happens in these local revenue measures, especially countywide, Board of Supervisors initiated measures, tends to get a lot of media play. And so, we've seen it with Measure Z. All of the committee meetings are aired. There's a lot of stories on them. You can see exactly where the funding goes. And I would expect there's already been a lot of attention around Measure O. And I would expect that there would be a lot of attention around, Measure Z. I would expect there would be a lot of attention around Measure O, and a lot of public pressure on the elected supervisors who made the determination who would make the determination on where this funding is spent.
Okay. Thank you so very much for taking your time and giving us your expertise. Much appreciated.
And I will, similar to what Kristen mentioned, if you want to search on our website, humboldtgov.org, you can search for Measure O, and you can find a resource page there with our resolution and partial analysis and a little bit more history on how we got to this point.
Great. Many thanks.
Thank you.
All right. Moving on to the state propositions. Slide 39, please. So 5 citizens initiatives qualified for the ballot. They relate to changes to drug and theft penalties, the state's minimum wage, local rent control, Medi-Cal drug program regulations, and a tax on managed care organizations. The state legislature voted to send an additional 3 constitutional amendments and 2 bond issues to the statewide ballot in November. There's an amendment to establish the right to marry, constitutional amendment. There's a constitutional amendment to remove involuntary servitude as punishment for crime, and an amendment to lower the voter threshold from 16.67% to 55% for local bond issues that fund housing projects and public infrastructure, and also 2 bond issues totaling $20 billion, 10 for public education facility improvements, and 10 for environmental protection projects. Next slide, please. The Legislative Analyst Office reported that California is repaying an estimated $80 billion in bonded debt. The state spends approximately $6 billion from the general fund each year to repay bonds. That's about 3% of the total. First bond measure is Proposition 2. This is already up. The question is, should the state authorize $10 billion in bond funds to build new or renovate existing public school and community college facilities? Proposition 2 would provide $8.5 billion to K through 12 schools, including charter schools, and $1.5 billion to community colleges to renovate, fix, and construct facilities. The money would be distributed through matching grants, with the state paying a greater share of costs for less affluent districts and those with higher numbers of English learners and foster youths. Some of the money would be set aside for removing lead from water, creating transitional kindergarten classrooms, and building career and technical education facilities. Next slide, please. Thousands of California buildings are in poor shape. According to the Public Policy Institute of California, 38% of students attend schools that do not meet the state's minimum safety standards. Research has shown that students who attend school in substandard facilities tend to have lower attendance rates, lower morale, and lower achievement. Unlike other states, California does not pay for school repairs through a permanent funding stream. Money comes entirely from state and local bonds. The state's last school facilities bond, a $15 billion proposal in 2020, failed, leaving the state's school repair account nearly empty. Affluent school districts raise more money for repairs through local bonds because local property values are higher, thereby generating more money through local property taxes. Smaller and lower income districts struggle to raise enough money to pay for school repairs and often can't pass local bonds at all. As a result, they rely entirely on state bond funds for money. Next slide, please, 42. Supporters say that this money is crucial for making basic safety improvements in schools, as well as for important upgrades like modern science labs, performance arts spaces, and transitional kindergarten classrooms. The bond measure protects local control, as funding can only be used for projects approved by local school and community college districts, and there are strict taxpayer accountability protections. Supporters have raised $4.7 million for this. Next slide. Opponents say that the state should include school repairs in its regular budget rather than turn to taxpayers who they say are already overburdened. In addition, they argue that Prop 2 would not directly impact students. They say that California already has over $109 billion of outstanding and unissued bonds, and that Sacramento politicians overspend, issue bonds, and punish us with tax hikes. They say that politicians should prioritize education funding over free health care for illegal immigrants in our state budget. Opponents did not report having raised any money for this. Okay, that's Prop 2. Prop 3. Oh, I'm sorry. Please go back. The fiscal effects, I forgot that. The Legislative Analyst's Office did estimate that the cost to repay Prop 2 would be an estimated $500 million annually for 35 years. Thank you. Next slide. Now we're on Prop 3. The question for Proposition 3 is, should the California Constitution be amended to define marriage as a fundamental right for all, regardless of sex or race, and remove language that states that marriage is only between a man and a woman? Since the 2008 passage of Proposition 8, the California Constitution has contained this language: only marriage between a man and a woman is valid or recognized in California. The federal court decisions have held that the provision was unconstitutional under the 14th Amendment. And in 2015, the US Supreme Court held that states must allow and recognize same-sex marriage. So in practice, this ballot measure would not change who can marry. Next slide, please. The legislature placed this measure on the ballot to bring the California Constitution in line with existing federal law that gives same-sex couples the right to marry. By placing the freedom to marry in the California Constitution, the state would provide protections in the event that there is a rollback on protections currently afforded in the federal level. It would serve as preemptive protection after the US Supreme Court overturned federal abortion protections in 2022. At that time, Justice Clarence Thomas, in a concurring opinion, wrote that the court should also reconsider the constitutionality of same-sex marriage. So this prompted Congress to pass the Respect for Marriage Act, which requires states to recognize same-sex marriage performed in other states. But it would still leave the legality of same-sex marriages performed, same-sex marriages performed up to individual states if Obergefell versus Hodges were to be overturned. Next slide, please. So supporters of Prop 3 say the measure would remove obsolete, discriminatory language from the California Constitution and uphold the right to a practice already recognized by the highest court in the land. It reinforces California's commitment to civil rights and protects personal freedom. Although opponents warn of child marriages, incest, and polygamy, supporters point out that bigamy, marrying more than one person, and incest are illegal in California. Furthermore, California already allows child marriages as long as a parent or guardian gives consent and a court signs off. Supporters have raised $4.1 million for this proposition. Next slide, please. Opponents say that the measure's language is unclear and goes too far and would override marriage laws and remove protections against child marriages, incest, and polygamy. They argue that it is best for children to be raised by both mothers and fathers, and that the measure makes moms and dads optional. They say it threatens our shared values of healthy families, healthy children, and a healthy society. And they say that because same-sex marriage is already legal, the amendment fixes a problem that does not exist. No money was raised as reported at the time of this writing. Next slide, please. The legislative analysis, Prop 3 would not change who is allowed to marry in California, and this means that there would be no change in revenues or costs to state or local governments. That is Prop 3. Prop 4. Next slide, please. Proposition 4 is one of the two bond funds on the state ballot. The question is, should voters let the state sell $10 million in bonds for various projects to reduce climate risks and impacts? Approving Prop 4 would authorize $10 billion in debt to spend on environmental and climate projects, with the biggest chunk, $3.8 billion, for drinking water improvements and other water projects, such as protecting the state from floods and droughts and restoring rivers and lakes. The rest of the money would be spent on wildfire and extreme heat projects, natural lands, parks, wildlife, coastal lands, bay and ocean protection, clean energy projects, and agricultural projects. The bond prioritizes lower income communities and those most vulnerable to climate change, and it requires annual audits. Slide 51, please. Supporters of Prop 4 say, given the threat the state faces from wildfires, water pollution, and extreme heat, the need for spending on these issues is urgent. According to the State Water Board, nearly 1 million Californians lack access to drinking water that meets safety and reliability standards. In addition, recent wildfires have burned 2 million acres in California, releasing toxic smoke into the air and polluting drinking water supplies. Prop 4 invests in projects to protect and increase the state water supply and to prevent wildfires and reduce their intensity and give firefighters tools they need. Prop 4 also provides for coastal and flood management associated with sea level rise and protects forests, beaches, streams, and wildlife. Prop 4 protects the health of vulnerable seniors and children by removing pollution from the air and toxins in the water. Supporters say that there will be strong fiscal responsibility, accountability, and transparency via annual independent audits and full public disclosure. And they also state that dozens of environmental groups are backing the measure. Supporters have raised $698,000 as of the time of this writing. Slide 52, please. The opponents say bonds are the most expensive way for the government to pay for things. They say that California should pay for such projects within the state budget without taking on more tax debt, since clean drinking water and preventing wildfires are necessities, not luxuries. They say that the challenges we face now are the result of decades of neglect and mismanagement of our resources. Bonds are borrowed money that must be paid back plus interest. Governor Newsom has already declared a budget emergency because the state spends more than it takes in. How many programs will have to be cut in the future to pay for Prop 4? The Legislative Analyst's Office, according to the opponents, say that we had a $62 billion deficit this year. 2 years ago, California had a nearly $100 billion surplus. If these climate projects had been prioritized then, we could have covered the entire cost of the bond with just 10% of the surplus. Also, opponents say, Prop 4 provides funding for unproven technologies with no real evidence of success and lacks specific standards for measuring success. Opponents have not raised any money as of this writing. Slide 53, please. The Legislative Analyst's Office estimates that paying back the bond loan for Prop 4 would cost the state $400 million a year for 40 years. Taxpayers could spend $16 billion over the life of the debt. However, the bonds would fund projects that reduce future risk and the costs of damage from disasters. Proposition 5, after which I get a break. Question: shall local bond measures to fund housing bonds for low and middle income Californians and public infrastructure be allowed to pass with 55% of the vote approval instead of the 66.7% currently required? This proposition amends the state constitution. Slide 55, please. Looking at the time here, I'm going to rush this a little bit. Next slide, please. This proposition was put forth by the legislator in an effort to assist in California's housing crisis. California is in critical need of more affordable housing. A typical house here costs about twice the national average, and rents are about 50% higher than in other states. Next slide. So the proposal would lower the voting threshold from 66.67 to 55, and it would apply to housing program bonds for low-income families, seniors, and other vulnerable populations. Next slide, please. Supporters say that it would make it easier for communities to approve and build affordable housing, that it gives local voters more autonomy, that it shifts local public policy away from the state, and that it has strict accountability provisions. Next slide. Opponents say that it was written by politicians to push the cost of infrastructure onto local governments, that due to easier approval, more borrowing may take place. Data shows that 20 to 50% more bond measures in recent years would have passed under the Prop 5 lower approval threshold, and that it will lead to higher property taxes in order to pay back the borrowed money. There's some concern that the definition of infrastructure is so broad that special interests could take advantage of it. Next slide. Fiscal effects. If Prop 5 passes, it would likely mean that more local bond measures would pass, resulting in increased funding for housing assistance and public infrastructure. The amount of increase could be at least a couple of $2 billion over the life of the bonds and could vary across local governments. If more bonds were approved, then local governments would have more costs, which would have to be paid for with higher property taxes. The overall impact on California's state budget is uncertain. So that's Prop 5. And now moving on to Ann Hartline for Prop 6 and 32.
All right. Thank you, Karen. Let's see. So, and thank you all for hanging in there. These are some complicated and wordy issues. So thank you for your patience. So the Proposition 6 basically eliminates the constitutional provision allowing involuntary servitude for incarcerated persons. The question is, should the California Constitution be amended to remove the provision that allows involuntary servitude to be used as a punishment for a crime, prohibit incarcerated people from being punished for refusing a work assignment, and allow incarcerated people to voluntarily accept work assignments in exchange for credit to reduce their sentences? So, I'm going to talk for a few minutes about, thank you. Basically, the situation is that California's Constitution mirrors the 13th Amendment to the US Constitution, which allows for involuntary servitude as a punishment for crimes. The 13th Amendment of the US Constitution states in Section 1, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Although no courts explicitly order forced labor as part of criminal sentencing, it is standard practice to force incarcerated people to perform labor. California is among 16 states with an exception clause for involuntary servitude in its state constitution. In 2018, Colorado passed a state constitutional amendment banning involuntary servitude. Utah and Nebraska followed suit in 2020. And finally, in 2022, voters in Alabama, Oregon, Tennessee, and Vermont removed language allowing involuntary servitude from their state constitutions. More than 94,000 Californians are currently in state prison. Black people are disproportionately represented in the person population, accounting for 28%, despite making up less than 6% of California's overall population. Next slide, please. Oh, I'm sorry. There we go. Thank you. All right. So an explanation. This amendment expressly amends the California Constitution by amending a section, and this is shown here how it would actually change in the Constitution. So things that are crossed out are wording that will be eliminated, and things that are italicized is wording that would be added. So statement or Section A and Section 6, Part A would read, slavery and involuntary servitude are prohibited. And then Part B would read, the Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation shall not discipline any incarcerated person for refusing a work assignment. B, nothing in this section shall prohibit the Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation from awarding credits to an incarcerated person who voluntarily accepts a work assignment. And D, amendments made to this section by the measure adding this subdivision shall become operative on January 1st, 2025. Next slide, please. So the fiscal effects of Proposition 6 on state and local criminal justice costs are uncertain. If people in prison or jail no longer face consequences for refusing to work, prisons and/or jails might have to find other ways to encourage working. If this is done by increasing pay, costs would increase. If this is done by giving more time credits instead, costs would decrease because people would serve less time potentially. Next slide, please. So the supporters say that Proposition 6 restores human dignity by ending forced labor, which constitutes slavery and violates human rights. Supporters say Prop 6 enhances public safety by prioritizing rehabilitation. Supporters say Prop 6 ends slavery as a ending slavery is a bipartisan priority with widespread support. And Prop 6 supports the national movement by closing the loophole in California's version of the 13th Amendment. One additional point here is that Proposition 6 was placed on the ballot by California state lawmakers with bipartisan support. So no arguments were officially submitted against Proposition 6. So that concludes Proposition 6 very quickly. And then we'll go on to Proposition 32. I do not know why we jumped from 6 to 32, but that is up for someone of a higher level of expertise than I. So Proposition 32 raises the minimum wage. And the question is, should California raise its minimum wage to $18 an hour by January 1, 2026, and then each year based on inflation? And just so that it's clear, a yes vote on this measure means the state minimum wage would be $18 per hour in 2026. After that, it would it would go up each year based on how fast prices are going up. A no vote on this measure means the state minimum wage likely would be about $17 per hour in 2026. After that, it would go up each year based on how fast prices are going up. So as an explanation, California's minimum wage is currently $16 an hour. This measure increases that minimum as follows. Employers with 26 or more employees would pay $17 hourly for the remainder of 2024 and $18 hourly beginning on January 1st, 2025. Employers with 25 or fewer employees would pay $17 hourly beginning January 1, 2025, and $18 hourly beginning January 1, 2026. So I think I'll kind of skip that. Sort of explains it. It's some additional explanation. Basically, the minimum wage per hour would in 2026, the minimum wage would be $18 per hour for all employees, and inflation adjustments would be paused after 2027. So basically, the gist of this is in 2025, California would have different minimum wages for employers of different sizes. And the minimum wage would be adjusted for inflation every year starting in 2027. Just a note for voters, the text for this proposed law includes language going back to minimum wage laws beginning in 2014, hence the many sections shown on pages 94 to 97 in the official voter information guide for the general election issued by the California Secretary of State. So just background, state and local laws set minimum wages. Employers must pay their workers at least the minimum wage, which at this time in the state of California is $16 per hour. Bottom line, this measure, if approved, higher minimum wage in 2025, minimum wage $18 an hour in 2026, inflation wage adjustments until 2027. So next slide, please. So legislative analysis of the fiscal effects kind of depends on economic effects. It would mean higher wages, and higher minimum wage tends to push up wages for other workers, likely higher prices due to increased business costs, potentially likely lower profits, and effect on jobs. The number of jobs in the state could go up or it could go down. In terms of government costs, higher government costs would result from needing to pay government workers higher, but there could be potential savings from lower enrollment in health and human services programs, such as Medi-Cal. Next slide, please. So these are what the supporters of Proposition 32 say, that every Californian who works at least a full-time 40-hour work week should be able to afford life's basic needs. Supporters say that when people who work hard are paid wages that aren't enough to cover life's basic needs, a bigger burden is put on taxpayers to make up the difference that some corporations aren't honoring. Supporters say that Proposition 32 will bring a much-needed raise to 2 million California workers and create a more prosperous system. And supporters of Prop 32 say when more Californians earn a fair wage for their work, our entire economy does better. Next Oh, I did want to say, these arguments come from Joe Sandberg, anti-poverty advocate, with rebuttal to the argument against Proposition 32 coming from Ada Braceño, co-president of Unite Here Local 11, Nanette Berrigan, Congresswoman, U.S. House of Representatives, California 44th District, and Sarah Jayaraman, president of One Fair Wage. Next slide, please. Opponents say that Proposition 32 increases your personal costs. Opponents say that Prop 32 makes California's huge deficit worse. Opponents say Proposition 32 punishes small businesses. Opponents say Proposition 32 costs jobs, and that Proposition 32 hurts the very workers it's supposed to help. These arguments and the rebuttals to the argument in favor of 32 come from Jot Condi, president of the California Restaurant Association, Jennifer Barrera, president of the California Chamber of Commerce, and Ron Fong, president of the California Growers Association. And there we have Proposition 32.
Thank you so much, Anne. So we're running up on the end of the time, but we still have 4 more propositions. And Bird, would you be willing to go ahead with yours right now? And then I'll finish up with 32. And we invite you to stay longer. Jane has assured me that we can go over time, and I hope that you'll stick around to hear the last of the state propositions. Bird is going to do 34, 35, and 36.
Yes, so.
Starting with slide 75, please.
So Proposition 34 is an initiative statute, and the question is, the measure asks, should certain healthcare providers be required to spend 98% of revenues from a federal discount prescription drug program on direct patient care? And should the state be permanently authorized to negotiate Medi-Cal drug prices? It would require 98% of net revenue from federal discount programs to be spent on direct care. And it applies to specific healthcare providers, penalizes non-compliance by revoking licenses and nonprofit status, and permanently authorizes the state to negotiate Medi-Cal drug prices on statewide basis. Right now, Medi-Cal, a federal state program, pays for prescription drugs for low-income people as part of their health coverage. It has a single approach called Medical RX that saves the state money because it pays for drugs at discounted prices. The federal program provides discounts to certain eligible healthcare providers that focus on serving low-income people. These providers generally earn net revenue by charging healthcare plans, but not Medi-Cal, more for drugs than it costs to provide the drugs. Currently, they can decide how to spend that revenue. This proposition would restrict how these providers could spend their net revenue in California, 90% for patient care. The legislative analyst states that there would likely be millions of dollars needed to enforce the new rules, but that fees on the entities affected would pay for those costs. Few entities would be affected, so the fiscal effect would be limited. Next slide, please. The proponents of the bill say that it will cut costs by allowing the state to negotiate costs. They say it will ensure that revenue from discount programs will go to patient care rather than wherever the provider wants to spend it. They say it will hold healthcare providers accountable by making them spend any profits in line with their original mission. Some proponents are Assembly Member Evan Lowe, former chair LGBT Caucus Kelly Gossip, the ALS Association, and Serrano, Latino Health Heritage Los Angeles. The opponents say that Prop 34 is an attempt by the California Apartment Association to harm a specific provider, the AIDS Healthcare Foundation, AHF, and its founder, Michael Weinstein, because of his longtime support for rent control. They say that it is retribution for AHF putting Proposition 33, the rent control initiative, on this ballot. They say that this proposition is weaponizing the initiative process by allowing powerful interests to target a single organization to punish and shut them up. They say that with improved health care for AIDS patients, their biggest need now is housing for AIDS patients, so attention to affordable housing is in line with their mission. Some opponents are Geraldine Stapleton, National Association for Women, Larry Gross, ED Coalition for Economic Survivals, and Condessa M. Curley, MD, MPH, board member of AIDS Healthcare Foundation, also Dolores Huerta. And that is Proposition 34. I'd like to go to the next slide with Proposition 35. Question. Proposition 35, an initiative statute, asks, should California make permanent an existing tax on managed healthcare plans to provide ongoing funding for Medi-Cal and other health services? Currently, there is a tax on healthcare plans such as Kaiser Permanente that must be approved every few years. It will expire in 2026 if it is not approved again. It supplements federal funds to help pay for healthcare services for low-income families, seniors, disabled persons, and other Medi-Cal recipients. Right now, the healthcare plans are taxed based on the number of people they cover, including those in Medi-Cal. Some of the tax revenue goes to existing medical costs, saving money from the general fund. Some of the tax revenue is used to increase funding for Medi-Cal and other health programs. This is a new use for the tax revenue and will begin in 2025 and 2026. They will likely result in about $4 billion more for Medi-Cal annually. About half of this will come from the health tax, with the rest coming from federal funding. The health tax will end in 2026 unless it is approved again. This proposal will make the health tax permanent starting in 2027. But it does not change the tax. There will be some changes to which services get more funding, so increased costs would be in effect. There would also be increased state costs from the general fund because Proposition 35 reduces the amount of health plan tax that can be used for existing costs of Medi-Cal. This might be $1 to $2 billion in 2025 and 2026, which is 0.5 to 1% of the total general fund. Next slide, please. Arguments in favor of Proposition 35. California's health service is in crisis with hospitals and clinics closing, as we know, in this area, and emergency rooms extremely crowded. Patients wait for months for both preventive and specialty care. California has redirected more than $30 billion in healthcare funding to other purposes. Children in our most vulnerable populations are most affected by this crisis. Proposition 35, the proponents say, provides dedicated ongoing funding to the healthcare system without raising taxes. Proposition 35 extends an existing tax on healthcare plans that would otherwise expire in 2026. Prop 35 protects and expands access to healthcare for everyone by expanding access to preventive healthcare, thus reducing waiting time in emergency rooms. It provides funding for more first responders and paramedics, primary care and physicians' offices, community health centers, OBGYNs, and specialty care such as cancer and cardiology. It provides strong accountability that money will be spent on patient care. It is supported by a long list of healthcare workers in all areas. Proposition 35 did not have any arguments against it submitted, although Governor Newsom has indicated he opposes it because it will make changes in the budget which he has proposed. And that is Proposition 35. Proposition 36, next slide, please. The question, should California allow people to be charged with felonies for possessing certain drugs and for thefts under $950 if the defendant has 2 prior drug or theft convictions? This act shall be known as the Homelessness, Drug Addiction, and Theft Reduction Act. It amends and adds sections to the Health and Safety Code and the Penal Code, and adds a section to the Government Code. It is very complicated. In 2014, voters passed Prop 47, which changed some crimes from felonies to misdemeanors, including stealing items worth less than $950 unless the person had prior convictions for previous crimes and drug possession. It created the Safe Neighbor and School Fund, which took savings from lower incarceration rates to mental health and drug treatment programs to help keep kids in school, and for victim services. One of Prop 47 purposes was to reduce overcrowding in prisons. Since 2014, prison population has decreased, and money has been redirected to the Safe Neighborhood and Schools program. Proposition 36 is proposed to reform laws that have dramatically increased homelessness, drug addiction, and theft throughout California. Next slide, please. It would propose to reform the laws that have dramatically decreased homelessness. It would provide drug and mental health treatment for addiction to hard drugs, including fentanyl, cocaine, heroin, and methamphetamine. It would provide a new court process for some people who are charged with a treatment-mandated felony instead of a misdemeanor, to be used in certain circumstances. If these people finish treatment, their charges will be dismissed. It adds fentanyl to existing laws that prohibit the possession of hard drugs while armed with a loaded firearm. Adds fentanyl to existing laws that prohibit the trafficking of large quantities of hard drugs. It gives judges discretion in sentencing dealers to state prison rather than county jail in certain circumstances. Would warn convicted hard drug dealers and manufacturers that they can be charged with murder if they continue to traffic in hard drugs and someone dies as a result. It would reinstate penalties for hard drug dealers while trafficking results in death or serious harm to a drug user. And it would increase penalties for people who repeatedly engage in theft. It would add new laws to address the problem of significant smash and grab thefts or those committed by multiple thieves working together. The fiscal effects on state and local governments would occur, but the extent is uncertain and would depend on decisions made by local prosecutors. It is likely that more people will be sent to prison, and court cases for felonies will probably take more time and resources than those for misdemeanors. It would also reduce the savings that came from Proposition 47, probably in the low tens of millions of dollars annually, leaving less to go to drug treatment, school programs, and victim services. It would also have some effect on local savings or increased costs because of the change from sending people to prison or to the county jail. Next slide, please. Arguments in favor of 36. Supporters say that the tougher laws against smash and grab thefts will protect businesses everywhere. Smash and grab thefts are often carried out by 3 or more people, and the consequences and accountability would be increased for such thefts. They say Proposition 36 will allow prosecutors to combine value of stolen articles from multiple thefts to increase accountability for serial thieves. They say it will reduce crime and substance abuse by mandating treatment for felony drug offenders. Fentanyl, cocaine, and theft, they say, must be addressed in stricter laws. Some supporters include California District Attorneys Association, founder of Crime Victims United, Harriet Salerno, and Michael Hedges, president of the California Small Business Association. Also, Sheriff Hunsell has indicated to the Human Rights Commission his support of 36 because he said judges could sentence offenders to jail time or treatment. Next slide, please. Opponents say that the law already requires felonies for many of the situations in Proposition 36, and that the purpose of 36 is just to increase prison time for unrelated crimes. Opponents also say that Proposition 36 will make California less safe because it will cut funding for mental health treatment, drug treatment, and rehabilitation programs that stop repeat offending. They say Proposition 36 is too extreme. This is not the way to address fentanyl, cocaine, and theft. They say that Proposition 36 will not make communities safer, but will waste taxpayer dollars on methods that have proven to be ineffective. Opponents include Diana Beckton, District Attorney, Contra Costa County, William Lansdowne, retired police chief, City of San Diego, and Jeff Nickel, victim advocate, Crime Survivors for Safety and Justice. A yes vote for Proposition 36 will put all of these new things into effect. A no vote will keep it as it is now, retaining the things from Proposition 47 from 2014. And that's the end of 36. Karen, I think.
Yay! Thank you
33.
so much. Thank you so much, Bird, and thank you for staying after.
And-
We need
and
to
I do-
go. We need to go back now to slide 68 so that we can do Proposition 33.
And
and I
I
will
am
do
so
this
sorry, I
quickly.
must leave, but I'm sorry. Goodbye.
Thank you for staying late.
Okay.
And thank you to all of you who've hung in there until the very last proposition. You've got a lot of endurance. Much appreciated.
Karen, is it okay if I chime in for just a moment?
Please.
Okay, everybody, I am going to put a link in the chat. It's going to be a Google form for those of you who want to get the resources today listed in the presentation. I linked it in the chat earlier, but I'm afraid it would probably been lost by now. So if you fill out the form, and I'll send you an email with the resources included in today's presentation.
Wonderful. Erin, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. All right, the last proposition is Proposition 33. And this is, it's about rent control. The question is, should the Costa-Hawkins Rental Housing Act of 1995, which is a state law, be repealed so that local governments can regulate rents? Next slide, please. The situation is, as we all know, housing in California is expensive. Renters typically pay about 50% more for housing than in other states. And in some areas, rents are more than double the national average. There is not enough housing for everyone who wants to live in California, so renters have to compete, which drives the prices up. Next slide. To help with this, some cities in California have rent control laws that limit how much landlords can increase the rent each year. About a quarter of Californians live in areas with rent control, and these include Los Angeles, San Francisco, and San Jose. However, another state law called the Costa-Hawkins Rental Housing Act restricts local rent control in 3 ways. It does not allow rent control on single-family homes. It does not allow rent control on any housing built after February 1st, 1995. And it does not let local laws control the rent a landlord can charge a new tenant. Next slide, please. Prop 33 says the state government cannot limit local government's power to expand or limit rent control. In essence, it would repeal the Costa-Hawkins Rental Act. It would allow cities and counties to regulate rents for any type of housing property they choose, and it would not matter when the property was built or what type of building it is. Next slide. Fiscal impacts. Expanded rent control would provide some people with more affordable housing. On the other hand, housing scarcity could occur if landlords sell their properties, convert it to condos, etc., rather than rent them out. The value of rental properties could decrease because potential buyers might not want to pay as much for these rent-controlled properties. The measure would likely reduce the amount of money cities, counties, special districts, and schools receive from property taxes, and this decrease could be in the tens of millions of dollars each year. Next slide, please. Supporters say that Prop 33 lets local governments enact rent control to protect renters and allow renters to stay in their homes and apartments while more affordable housing is being built. They say that it allows local governments to decide whether and how much to control rents based on the unique situations in their communities. And they say that billionaire corporate landlords are currently calling the shots and profit from the lack of housing supply. Next slide, please. Opponents of Prop 33 say that it could block new affordable housing from being built, which could worsen the housing crisis. They say that it could eliminate homeowner and renter protections that already exist, and that available rental properties may be reduced due to landlords selling off property. Prop 33 could reduce home values, leading to lower property tax revenue. So just an aside here, does rent control work? And the answer is it's complicated and experts disagree. There was a 2019 study in San Francisco that found that tenants in controlled units were 20% more likely to stay in those apartments compared to people who did not have access to rent control. The vast majority of those were incentivized to remain in their rent-controlled apartments. Vast majority would have been displaced from San Francisco had they not been covered. And this was especially true for renters of color. That finding seems to bolster advocates' claims that rent control is effective at stemming displacement. But the research also pointed to evidence that bolstered opponents' claims. It found that landlords responded to the policy by converting their properties to condos, selling them, or redeveloping. Over time, that led to a 15% drop in rental housing in the city and a shift toward buildings that cater to higher income residents. As the traditional economists had predicted, it drove up costs for people who were not already in rent-controlled apartments. So that is Prop 33. And again, we're at the end of our presentation. I thank you all for your patience, for staying late. Thank you to OLLI, to Aaron and Jane for handling the technical parts, and for all of you voters who have taken the time to become more educated about your vote. Your vote really does count. Every single vote counts. So thank you all, and good afternoon.
Thank you so much, Karen, and all the presenters. You did a fantastic job. And yeah, like I said, if you want to open the chat, there's a link in there, and you can get some resources.
Wonderful. Thank you, Aaron.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all.